It would be remiss, of course, not to note that perhaps Rotary Melbourne's most famous president, Sir John Monash, was very involved with the establishment of a state electricity commission and arguably undergirded the energy transition of a very different age with different technology. But he was a very forceful man and normally got his way, I think always got his way with cabinet, as far as I can work out in Victoria. It's not going to be possible to do justice to all of our speakers in these brief introductions, but I didn't write down yoga or yodi anywhere. So yes. So Sarah Bice is a professor in the Australian National University Crawford School of Public Policy, where she co-founded and directed the ANU 12S Institute for Infrastructure in Society. Is that right? Until recently, Sarah served as the head of Crawford's Policy and Governance Department. Her previous experience informing tonight's discussion includes Deputy Director, the Melbourne Energy Institute, a professorship at Tsinghua, Beijing, and I knew I was going to get that wrong, and President, International Association for Impact Assessment. And I first heard Sarah talking on a podcast. So be warned, if you talk on a podcast, you might well end up as a speaker at a Rotary Melbourne function. Our second speaker is Mary Barry, another one, who is founding director, CEO of Circular Eco and Women of Offshore Wind, WOW. Amongst many other awards, Mary won the Innovation in Energy Transition Award from Subsea Energy Australia. She currently chairs or is co-chair of Subsea Energy Australia. Mary is not a complete stranger to the club, having attended a meeting when the then CEO of Star of the South, I've got down here prospective wind farm operator, but it's pretty close, isn't it? They've got a licence, so will be, came to speak. Mary is also heavily interested in, like Rotary, promoting women and gender equity and promoting women in STEM. And of course, our third speaker is Professor Dr. Alan Finkel, very well known to us. Like Sir John Monash, he started off as an engineer, and Alan was Australia's 8th chief scientist and is still currently, according to what I could find, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, Alan, special advisor to the Australian Government on low emissions technologies and chair of Australia's Low Emissions Technology Investment Advisory Council. Is that right? Still? Was. He is continuing to engage with the education sector and was Chancellor of Monash University. He is author of Getting to Zero and more recently in 2023, Powering Up, both about the energy transition. The speakers will all speak for between 7 to 8 minutes. We'll then take some questions and finishing formal proceedings if the chair is on the ball around 7 p.m. But I'm sure the speakers who are able to stay a bit longer will be happy to keep going with some discussion over drinks and some more of those canapes, hopefully, which will arrive shortly. All right, thank you. So, Sarah, do you want to start? Yep.
Okay, good evening, Philip. Thank you so much for inviting me, and to Chris for having me at Rotary. When Philip sent the email after hearing me on a podcast, I thought it was spam. Fortunately, I did respond, and here we all are. My role this evening in about 5 to 7 minutes is to set the context for a very important discussion around the energy transition and shifting our attention tonight away from the technical components of that transition to the societal components. So really thinking about this troublesome idea of a social license to operate. I have worked in and around the nexus of communities and major projects for more than 2 decades now. My very first real job was with Oxfam Australia in their mining and extractives advocacy campaign back in the early 2000s. And in that role, I was working with more than 7 different countries, most of them developing nations and also very remote parts of Indigenous Australia, experiencing the social and environmental impacts of big mining projects. And it made me realize how important it is to deal with what we think of as the non-technical aspects of a very technical endeavor. And so today we're thinking about the renewable energy transition, and I'll bring some of these broader lessons from what I've learned working in this very engineering, Alan, I work with a lot of engineers, this very engineering-centric space as a social scientist. The research institute that I co-founded and direct at the Australian National University focuses on all types of major infrastructure projects, including renewable energy. And we run Australia's longest standing, now longitudinal survey of the social and community aspects of major project selection, design, and delivery. And so these results here are from our 6th annual State of Infrastructure and Engagement Survey. And if any of you need a sleep aid or you're genuinely interested in these things, it's all available online. What we find year on year when we ask infrastructure sector professionals, what factors have been most influential where you've experienced project delays or cancellations? Year on year, social and community stakeholder pressure is amongst the top 3 most influential factors to project delays or cancellations. So what's important about that? Across all types of projects in Australia, if we flip this around, year on year, usually less than 14%. In fact, the highest we've ever had in people saying technical issues were a major issue is about 14%. Year on year, technical issues and access to technical expertise, which is unfortunately hidden below our Zoom panel there, these are our 2 most least influential issues. So in Australia, we really have the technical piece right, and I'm sure Alan will talk more about the technical components later, but I think that rings true for renewables. So the social piece is really important to our capacity to deliver major technical engineering projects and programs, including renewable energy. Tonight, we're talking about a social license. This is a really troublesome concept because what does it mean? It is consistently used as a kind of weasel word. In the mining sector for years, there were companies that would say, we earn and maintain a social license to operate. What does that mean and how do you do that? Very succinctly, a social license to operate is the level of acceptance of a project within a defined community. And over many years of research now, what we've come to know is that initially we thought a social license was about a particular project, say a wind farm. But now we know that there can be community levels of social license around a certain industry, and even industry. And today I was reading a PhD where the scholar is theorizing a national or a societal level of social license. So this is something that's quite important to think about. And here in this picture, what you can see is that for renewables, we are going to need very much an industry and perhaps even a national societal level of social license for renewables because that delivery stream is quite huge. CSIRO last year completed a major study of Australians' attitudes towards renewable energy. And what's really interesting in this is what are Australians most concerned about in terms of social and community issues? Number 1, affordability. So how is the transition going to affect my power bill? What are the benefits going to be to me and my community directly? And we know as well from this research and from our own research at the Institute that our regional and rural communities, who are the ones likely to bear the brunt of the infrastructure that's being delivered, are also the ones who are least accepting currently of the transition. And what CSIRO is saying at the moment is that we really need to work on improving public understanding of what the transition needs to entail in order to improve buy-in. Now, I've got some opinions on that as someone who's worked in this space a very long time, and you can ask me about them in the questions. Where are we at nationally and as a society in Australia? And it's very hard because we're such a diverse society to make any one generalized statement. But very recently, the Australian Energy Industry Commissioner released a report. So this came out earlier this year in March 2024. And a survey done by the AEIC found that 92% of respondents report being dissatisfied with the engagement that they have received around renewables. Now, as someone who has spent my entire career working with communities around community engagement and social impact assessment, this is a huge red flag for us wanting to deliver the renewables transition with the urgency and timeliness that is required. From my own research in the Institute, and this reflects the work of a very large team of researchers, what we have found as well is that across the board, Australians are experiencing very intensive infrastructure environments, and those communities who are experiencing 4 or more or 6 or more projects at one time are feeling unheard and overwhelmed. You can see here on the slide, you can see there's what we call a threshold effect. Those communities are less likely to agree that what's happening around them is transparent. They are less likely to agree that the regulation guiding that delivery of infrastructure is effective. They are less likely to report that they have positive relationships with the governments and developers delivering projects. And they are less likely to agree, and again, it's under the Zoom and we'll give you the slides later, but they are less likely to agree that there is a good overall planning picture for their communities. And this is huge in Australia right now because Infrastructure Australia estimates that of the mega projects being delivered, approximately 92% have another mega project within 250 kilometres. And almost 50% of those have another mega project within 5 kilometres. So this intensive infrastructure environment is really going to shape how communities experience and feel about the renewables transition. And finally, my point here is this is happening around the world. I've just come back from the International Association for Impact Assessment 43rd Annual Conference in Dublin, Ireland. This is the world's largest membership body of impact assessment practitioners of all types and stripes: environmental, health, social, human rights. And what I was hearing time and again at the conference, whose theme was a fair and just transformation, is that communities are starting to protest the renewables transition, not because they're anti-renewables, but because they are not being consulted and engaged in a way that is respectful and appropriate to major project delivery. So that is the context that I see from the social side of things. Thanks, Philip.
Sarah, thank you. That was an amazing, insightful presentation. That pressured me to do a presentation as well, by the way, everybody. Helen and Sarah. And also want to acknowledge the incredible work that Alan does as well, being worked with Alan a few years ago in the Commonwealth. So, yeah, thanks, Alan. At Circular Eco, basically, we believe in the power of collaboration, connecting organisations, and in some instances of connecting countries to drive that meaningful change. We bring together industry experts, academia, community leaders and policymakers to create inclusive strategies for energy projects. For example, I worked on the Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Act from the legislative regulatory framework perspective, and that took us a few years, and that was also setting up the community engagement framework for the regional areas. And that kind of was in a task in itself, because renewable energy, offshore wind, wasn't people weren't that keen on it because the awareness was not there. So, you know, it was from visual amenity, or no, this is going to ruin my surfing, or my it's going to hurt the fishes. But it was just that kind of continuous getting on the ground engagement component in regards to building that Act. So the Act will now allow technologies like offshore wind to be built in Commonwealth waters, but the regime itself is technology agnostic. So there'll be other technologies that come into play as we progress through. Circular Eco is like a central advisory, project management and strategy building company that guides organisations through the energy transition. We bring experts together for various projects, so there's not one group for one thing. So, yeah, over the past decade, a reputation has been built on delivering entrepreneurial and innovative solutions for renewable energy projects and also energy transition initiatives. Our work flows through our subsidiaries as well. So there's a few there. So watch this space in 2024. Poor Alan and Sarah don't realise they're going to get involved, but each focuses on the specific circular economy aspects that enable growth and commercialisation in these specific pillars. For instance, we're working with some marine users that have got prototypes at the moment in WA that because supply chain of vessels is going to be a huge issue for us moving forward. So they've got some EV and trying to work out how we create they travel on what we call foils and introduce the manufacturing component again back into the Australian economy. Australia's energy transition requires, obviously, thank you, Sarah, before, unprecedented infrastructure build. Governments, industry, project developers are struggling to get any traction. So for many reasons, some of it's legislative, it's become a whole politicking agenda at the moment. We need to kind of pull it out a little bit and leave it to the scientists to come up with some amazing data to support it. We need that paradigm shift to achieve the speed and scale the net zero transition demands. And Alan will take us through that in his presentation. We must reconceptualise how to think about benefits and resource the communities accordingly, because we need to resource them from a financial capability, a housing. There's a number of things that we are expecting communities to support these large infrastructure projects, but yet we are not putting our hands in our pockets to resource them accordingly, and they're really suffering. So, and that creates that angst as well. So we also support partnerships through the energy transition, and education and mentorship is at the heart of Circular Eco. It's essential to support our children from those foundational perspectives so they can grow and be mentored into future leaders. Through initiatives such as mentorship programs and educational outreach, Circular Eco inspires and empowers students to pursue careers in the STEM fields. We've introduced the arts, so including renewable energy and circular economy development. Why the arts? For many reasons, but that critical creative thinking and that design thinking should be at the forefront of what we do for future builds and engineering as well. So collaboration with our industry leaders like yourselves will be crucial to driving impactful change and building inclusive partnerships that support advancement in our workforce, both current and emerging workforce, because there's a lot of technologies that we do not have the curriculum or training packages or resources to support these new technologies. I invite you to join Circular Eco in our mission to advance sustainable energy solutions. Together we can make a significant impact. Thanks for your time, and yeah, let's work together to drive the change we wish to see. Thank you.
Okay, look, thank you, Sarah and Mary. You've been thinking about these social license issues for years and years and years. I've been thinking about technology for years and years. It's really only excuse me, I've got a sore throat. It's really only the last year or two that I've been thinking about the social license issues, and I've got to tell you, it keeps me up at night. It really is the biggest impediment to the transition that we have to have. Now, I'm an engineer. It's been mentioned a couple of times, and the engineering method means you always start by defining the problem. So let's look at the problem. First problem is the clicker doesn't work. Okay, I'll just use the screen. Can I do?
Yeah, if you just click here.
Okay, if I do the right arrow.
Okay.
Okay, the problem in two parts. The problem, of course, is the planetary problem, the environmental problem, and you all know about it. It's burning fossil fuels, increasing carbon dioxide. I don't need to tell you this, but I just want you to get a sense of how bad it is, because most people think, gosh, we created targets in 2015 at Paris. We've got targets, all good, all good. But this is a graph of the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide. And it sort of looks linear, but it's not. There I put in a red line that is not a line of best fit, but it's fitting the first 3 or 4 decades, 2 or 3 decades, and you'll see that things are actually accelerating. And if I do another line that is trying to fit the period around 2015, you're seeing it's continuing to get worse even since Paris. So the first message is governments making targets is almost irrelevant. What counts is execution, strategy, tactics, boots on the ground. The problem part 2, because of the rise in carbon dioxide, we're getting a temperature rise. Now, it's actually quite extraordinary. You know that expression that, or keep 1.5 alive. Paris is about not letting the temperature rise globally go above 1.5. If that fails, we'll go for 2. But 1.5 is what people keep talking about. It's too late. It's gone. That red line at the top is the last 12 months, the temperature per month. And what we're seeing is something we've never seen before, ever. Every single one of those 12 months is a record. There's no overlap of that orange line with any of the pale lines underneath. At the bottom, the dotted line is the reference for pre-industrial level. That's 1850 to 1900. That's what the Paris and all international measurements are based on. And you'll see there's a line of 1.5 and the orange line is substantially above it. The average of that orange line for the 12 months until 2 weeks ago was 1.63 degrees above the pre-industrial temperature. That doesn't mean it won't come down again a bit next year, because these things do fluctuate, but we've never seen anything like this. And in retrospect, it's not a surprise given that upsweep of carbon dioxide concentration. Oh, that's the problem. We actually do know what to do. We have to replace fossil fuels by electrifying all sources of energy, not just doing something about the existing electricity system, but transport and everything else. So we have to electrify all sources of energy. And where we can't use electricity directly, like in long distance aeroplanes, you will never, in your lifetime, your children's lifetime, get on a 400 passenger double aisle aeroplane in Melbourne and land in Singapore or Los Angeles, where that plane is powered by batteries. It's not going to happen. That plane needs a liquid fuel, whether the liquid fuel is pure hydrogen or a synthesized jet fuel. So what I said there is we can use more electricity to make hydrogen, more electricity to make hydrogen and synthesize it with carbon dioxide to make sustainable aviation fuel, but it's all about electricity. The conclusion is we're going to need vast quantities, not just a little bit more, but vast quantities of zero emissions electricity. So where does it come from? Well, it turns out there are only 4 sources of zero emissions electricity that can scale up. Solar photovoltaic, and I'm saying photovoltaic because solar thermal, where they use mirrors, doesn't scale. It's really just dropped off the agenda. It's the solar panels that scale. Wind farms, they scale to enormous capability. Hydroelectric power, remember hydroelectric power? That scales. And nuclear power. They're the 4 sources. When people talk about wave or tide or biomass to electricity or solar thermal or geothermal, it doesn't scale. These are the only 4 that scale. And in Australia, we've effectively said no to hydroelectric power. The last hydroelectric scheme in Australia was the Wivenhoe Dam in Brisbane in 40 years ago, 1984. It was commissioned. The Snowy 2.0 that you hear about all the time is not hydroelectric power. It's called pumped hydro. It's unfortunate the name is so similar. It's a battery. It's not a source of zero emissions electricity. So there is no prospect of ever doing any more hydroelectric power in Australia. Yes, in Thailand and Laos and other places, but not here. And we have explicitly, through legislation, said no to nuclear power in Australia. So we've got two. And they're difficult because they're variable, they depend on the weather, they don't understand the alternating current synchronous electricity system, but we have to make them work. Now, we do have ambition. As I said, the government's got targets. We've got a lot of planning that AEMO, the system operator, does with the system plan. We've got a lot of deliberate initiatives like the New South Wales roadmap, a lot of initiatives at the state and federal level. There's lots of money around. Financing is not a problem. There's financing from the private sector, there's financing from the government sector, there's lots of schemes. And you've got developers falling over themselves, eager to build programs. And I personally, as I said, have been focusing on the technology. I wrote a book called The Quarterly Essay, which was about the technology for getting to zero. Yes, we need to keep optimizing, but if we stopped optimizing, we already have what we need to get to zero. And the second book I wrote last year was about everything else except social license. I thought it was everything else. It's the supply chain, it's the finance, it's the workforce, it's the markets, it's the carbon taxes, everything else. But I didn't focus on social license. And I've got to say, in the last year, all I can ever think about now is social license, because deployment is really slow. So this graph is interesting. What this is showing is the number of utility scale, that means large-scale solar. So we're not talking about rooftop solar here. We're talking about big solar farms and wind farms. And you'll see that in 2017 and 2018, there were more than 60 projects approved in each of those years. In 2022 and 2023, it was 11 and 12 projects approved. Many reasons. The net result is that despite the good intentions of the current government, the rate of increase of solar and wind generation in Australia is slower under the current government than it was under the Morrison and Turnbull government, the annual increase. It's really surprising, and it comes down to this social licence issue. I call them barriers. I'm sorry, it's probably an inappropriate terminology, but I'm an engineer, so you'll forgive me. So there's the social licence ones, the landowner resistance. Farmers don't want transmission lines on their farms. The traditional owners and heritage requirements, it takes years and years and years for a mining company or a wind farm project developer to negotiate with the traditional owners. So many reasons. And then there's local biodiversity issues, which trump everything else. So those top three are what I would call community-oriented social licence. And then you've got the things that the government does that's shooting itself in the foot because it slows down development and opportunity. The permitting system is absolutely ponderous. In New South Wales, it's averaging between 5 and 8 years to get a permit for a wind farm. It's nuts. There's lack of central planning. We're leaving everything to the market. Well, this is not a natural transition that we're going through. It's driven by externality. More central planning would be good. And then the complexity of the national electricity market. The national electricity market is driven by the national electricity rules. And there have been 200 revisions to the rule, 200 since 2005, when the market was first formed. And it is now 1,750 pages of rules. It's extraordinary. And where we've landed is a winner and a loser. We've got an imbalance. The purpose of regulations, and you can expand this to everything else, the purpose of regulations is to protect and facilitate. Protect people and the environment and facilitate economic opportunity. But the regulations are now being delivered as protect or facilitate, and facilitate is off the table, and it's all about protection. So you end up with things like wind farms that would actually help to mitigate carbon dioxide emissions that improve the reduce global warming, and therefore improve global biodiversity, don't get approval because of a risk, not a guaranteed harm, but a risk to one pair of birds. It doesn't make any sense. There's actually no balance. And it's in the legislation. The legislation, the Federal EPBC Act, the Environmental Protection, Biodiversity and Conservation Act, only gives consideration to local biodiversity, doesn't give any brownie points for helping to protect the planet. So the planetary biodiversity is the loser. Okay. We need you guys. We need social scientists to elucidate what the barriers are. We need governments to lower the barriers. What you can't do is bulldoze the barriers. So we need the social scientists to understand them, the governments to tweak them to lower the barriers. And I don't have the time to go through it, but we can design, in some cases, but not all, engineering detours around the barriers. And I'm happy to discuss that later. But these are the fronts on which we have to engage. Okay, thank you.
Okay, wow, that was fabulous, wasn't it? Now, Joe, you told me something about an extra microphone. Ah, there we are. I'm sure there are going to be questions, but I just wonder if there are any more brief comments from any of the speakers now, adding anything very briefly. Sarah, the first speaker, gets a right to reply.
Oh, so exciting. I'm still going to call you a chief scientist. Since, oh, we social scientist. Hooray. Thank you.
It's a late revelation.
It's really wonderful to see that you're starting over the past year to think about the social components, because I really agree with you. We've got the technical pieces right. And in public policy, we often talk about wicked problems. Now, these are intractable problems for which we have no solution. There is a technical definition of wicked problems, and if anybody wants to study it, we can talk to you later. But climate adaptation and the energy transition, it's not a wicked problem, because we have the technology and we know what we need to do to solve it. So the issue then is, how do we solve it? But it's no longer a wicked problem. So I think so much of what you're putting up is really important, and we need more of our scientists now starting to talk about, we've got the technical expertise and capacity. How do we work with governments and communities to make this happen? And my final point before we hand over is, I agree with you about regulation. So one of the things that we study as social scientists are, what are the factors amongst Australian communities that drive project acceptance? And that includes acceptance of renewables. The number one factor driving community trust in Australia is the level of community members' confidence in the regulation overseeing the projects being delivered. So if the community is confident that the regulations are operating in their best interests and are protecting them and preserving their intergenerational futures, they are much more likely to accept those projects. So I think you're spot on with regulation, and I think it's a nexus where we do have an opportunity to make changes, because it's also what is critical to social license and trust when it comes to Australian communities.
Okay, any other comments? Otherwise, we've got a question over here. Second row. Excuse me, Swinky, I can't make out name tags.
That's okay. I'm Bruce Lillard. You talked about the need for mentorship programs. I'm just wondering who's going to do the mentorship. Have we got enough people?
Well, no, and that's a global issue at the moment as well. So the key component of circular eco is that also to bring back the ageing workforce, because the ageing workforce has got a lot of intellect, a lot of experience, and our younger generation probably would only give us about 4 hours and 46 minutes for a day. Sorry, William.
So the podcast is the end.
Podcasts, they're a channel as well, but I think where we can, I think face-to-face, national roundtables, workshops, brown paper lunches. Back then we used to do quite a lot in regards to the mentorship program. So we kind of slowly bringing that back, and we do it in WA and do it through creative ways as well. So,
I would just add to that one of the problems we've got with retraining people from the coal industry into the renewables industry, or young people to go through apprenticeship programs, is because of the stop-start nature of all the projects. There's not continuity in the workforce. And so some people are scared to get into it, or they do get into it and they have to drop out. So it's not a confidence building environment.
Because we do have the skills. Yeah, that's so true, Alan.
Yeah.
And we do have the skills. So in certain aspects, it's only a few, different units that people would have to study or get retrained on the job training that could help them transition into those renewable energy technologies. But another problem, that we do need to address is the actual pay gap. And the previous, some of the previous oil and gas roles pay double than what the new positions will attract. So that's
Okay, we've got a gentleman at the front and then here at the back.
I'm Dennis Strodel, and I've been working for the last 5 years on nuclear. The international cost pendulum from 100 points down, solar and wind are rated at 87% of cost, total cost. Black coal is at 69. Brown coal, because it's open cut, is at 49. And nuclear in France is at 32. Now, if we get nuclear in this state, it could be that we could be rated down around 15. And that would bring industry back to the front, so that like in the 1950s, when Victoria and New South Wales were the richest two colonies in the world, because we were exporting every second day by ship to the World War II devastation. We have got the chance to go forward. Yes, it will not be massive nuclear plants. They'll be what we call SMR or MMR units that will be able to fit into a 20-foot container and be put anywhere in the country, say at Euroa or whatever. And beside that, generating electricity and hydrogen.
All right.
Alan, what do you think?
Right.
Most of what I think is published on the ABC News website this morning, much to my surprise, because it was based on an interview about 4 or 5 months ago. Look, from the point of view of delivering zero emissions electricity, nuclear is excellent. From the engineering point of view, it's just fantastic. It's dispatchable, it's a low resource footprint, low real estate footprint, synchronous generation. It understands what I call the heartbeat of the AC electricity system. It strengthens the system. But from a cost point of view, I don't see it the same as you do, with apologies. What I've done is mapped out the builds of nuclear in the last 10 years, large scale builds over the last 10 years. And there are very few in OECD countries, and there are some horror stories. The big build that's going on in the UK at the moment will produce electricity guaranteed by the UK government at about $300 Australian per megawatt hour, which is more than 3 times probably 4 times our current wholesale price. It's a horror story, and same with the American ones. The good ones are one that finished in Finland recently and in the United Arab Emirates recently, which are coming in at about 1/3 of that cost. So they will produce electricity about $100 to $150, which is still more expensive than solar with batteries. The problem is you can't compare the cost of electricity in France all of those generators were built in the 60s, the 70s, or 70s and the 80s. The licensing requirements, the regulation requirements were much easier. It was done with national spirit, which was fantastic, and it's now depreciated. For us to do new build nuclear today, if we let the regulatory system do what it's doing for solar and wind, it'll be horrendously expensive. If we have a government that can actually lead the process very wisely and do what the CSIRO calls continuous deployment, so we just have a boring approach where we choose one big reactor that's been proven and do the same one under the same regulations again and again and again, then I think we could have modest price, not cheap, but modest price nuclear, and we would have the benefits of reliable supply. So I see it as important for the long term, but there is no possible way, even if, say, the opposition won an election at the end of this year or early next year, there is no possible way that we could get electrons generated, nuclear electrons generated in less than 15 to 20 years. It just won't happen. So we still have to do solar and wind. And your last point on small modular reactors, they're a wonderful concept. The beauty of, as you elucidated, the beauty is they're made in a factory, shipped in a container. They're not small, they're pretty big. You need to use very, very special trucks to move them around. But the modularity means that you get the benefits of mass production, if you like. The trouble is, the only examples are one converted military reactor in Russia and an experimental small modular reactor in China. There is no way that Australia would follow the Chinese or Russian lead. And if you look at all the OECD countries where we might follow their lead, there's not one small modular reactor in operation. There's not one small modular reactor in construction, and there is not a single small modular reactor that has had regulatory approval. So they're a long way out. They would be, I think, an important part of the future, but they are a long way out.
All right. I'm just aware we're running out of time. Hugh and then Christy. Yeah.
I'll try to be quick. I mean, Alan mentioned this quarterly essay. Over the long weekend, I read Joelle Gorgeous's current quarterly essay, which is absolutely devastating, called Highway to Hell, and I would suggest anybody reads it. It includes things that I didn't know about, with the current sea rise at more than a centimetre a year, with an anticipated more than a metre by 2100. There will be an increase of the sea coming into the land by at least 110 metres all the way around Australia, which will be 400 to 900,000 homes that will be underwater. Just extraordinary. To make the long weekend even worse, having watched playing Collingwood, I watched Four Corners, where they were talking about the problems with wind farms, where in a place in New South Wales for 10 years they've been negotiating it. The people whose property are on the top of the hills would get $1 million a year for the wind farms, and everybody else is objecting it for one reason or another. So that need for that social community engagement is extraordinarily strong.
Yes. So, Mary, we've got a woman of wind. Want to respond to that one?
That is so true. And transmission is slightly different as well, because the easements and the lines that have to go through certain properties and the sharing of the resource. Sometimes a farmer can get up to $1 million in lease arrangements per year, and yet their neighbouring farm gets nothing. So it's that kind of equity sharing. What do you do if they own the land? So it's a bit of a difficult one in regards to that, but Sarah?
The thing that's interesting about this, and we have people in the room who work in mining and extractives, is that mining and extractives have been dealing with these issues of boundaries and co-benefits for a very, very long time. And yet with renewables, we often don't look to these examples because they're seen as almost in total opposition to one another. But there are examples from mining where lessons have been learned about how to share and how to produce community co-benefits. And indeed, particularly in Canada, there's been some really excellent work with regional communities and also First Nations communities around co-benefit creation, where those communities are involved from the very beginning in determining how they wish to share the socioeconomic development that's coming to their area. So I think we're kind of missing some opportunities, a bit like with nuclear, we've got enough things to look to, but we're kind of forgetting that there are all these existing examples already that we could apply.
And can I just add one specific example? Engie, which is one of the big renewable energy companies, and a few others have now created a standard approach called the neighbour benefit program. And on wind farms, they use concentric circles around every single turbine. And if you live within 5 kilometres of a turbine, you get a certain amount of money each year. And if you live within 5 kilometres of 10 turbines, you get 10 times that amount. And if you live within 8 kilometres, you get about half. And if you live within 10 kilometres, you get about a quarter. So it's not just payments to the landowner, it's payment to anybody within the 5, 8, and 10, proportional payments to anybody within a 5, 8, and 10 kilometre radius, which I think is pretty clever. And what I've heard, but I don't know for sure, is it's better regarded by communities than when they come in and say, oh, we'll often do something for the community, we'll rebuild our bowling green. Only a few % of the people enjoy those benefits. It's the people who are affected that need to be compensated.
All right. Alan has to scamper off early, so last question. Sorry.
I'm Christy. I feel like I need to confess that I'm an engineer. But I'm the CTO of a company, Loam Energy, that's got a world-first tech that allows solar for apartment buildings so the solar generator is fairly shared. So feeling all these issues firsthand, for sure, completely agree with it. I was lucky enough to be in the room and speak at the Climate Investor Forum where Julia Gillard was the keynote speaker, and she's doing a lot of work in this space still. And one of the things that really stuck from her speech is the need to talk about climate in terms of health outcomes rather than degrees of warming. She explained that when she was the Prime Minister, a lot of policies that were put in place that were for the betterment of people, most people didn't understand them. And that if you went and talk to the majority of people in society, they say they care about the health of themselves and their family. And she's doing a lot of work around, I suppose, tying that messaging between climate change and health. And there's obviously a lot of research. So the question is, have you done research around that, whether that messaging would help with some of these barriers? Mainly to Sarah, but anyone who's got a thought on that.
So we haven't researched health particularly, but what we have asked communities is how do the perceived benefits that might come from a project in terms of livability factors? So that can be everything from access to healthcare, to schools, to green space, to if you're in an urban area, easy access to public transport. How do livability factors relate to the projects being proposed? And what are your perceived benefits? And what we have found is that there is a statistically significant relationship between perceived benefits, the level of perceived benefits, and they may be health benefits, and local levels of project acceptance. But what's even more important to me that we have found in this particular piece of research, where we surveyed close to 7,000 members of the Australian public, is that where perceived benefits are coming through, it actually can improve levels of resilience in local communities. And I think that's critical because we know that to be a key to community well-being. And so if by doing projects well, and also by talking to communities about projects in terms of the benefits that matter to them, not the terms of things that they may or may not care about or may or may not understand, we can not only help to improve acceptance, but we can more importantly improve levels of resilience in those communities. So our research does show that, and it shows it very clearly.
All right, that's fabulous. Anything else? Otherwise, I'm sure you can try and line up someone after the panel. It's now my happy task to thank what a wonderful, stimulating panel that was. I think we've really had a very special night of education, certainly from my perspective, for me, and illumination, and hopefully more of the illumination is from the right appropriate power source, the better. All right, so in our usual way, if we could thank everyone. And if I have your task to hand over the traditional, I think they might be socks. No, that's yours, Karen. You've got special socks and some more. So here we are. Thank you.
And thank you for.
Thank you. All right, so feel free to mingle. And our next meeting next week, which will be equally as exciting, is the Vice President's reporting day for our luncheon meeting. But please stay and enjoy each other's company and fellowship. Thank you. Yeah.